Otóż
Section 5, or panel 5, adds a forecastable title, The Memory of Revolution in former countries of the Russian Empire. And we have really some distinguished panelists from Russia and Poland. So a parity on the panel, I guess symbolized by the dialogue and understanding between Poland and Russia. So I'm really happy that the first presentation will be by our guest, Madam Olga Malinova, who has been dealing with historical memory in Russia. So the floor is yours, Madam. You have 20 minutes. And ladies and gentlemen, please follow your time frames. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. It's a great honor to me that I can start this panel. In my speech, I will try to define certain areas for discussion and thus to acquaint you with the outcomes of my studies and that are devoted to commemorating 100-year anniversary of the revolutions, plural, of 1917. Well, I can't talk about all of it in 20 minutes only, so I'll just put forward certain theses. Let me start with the fact that 1917 revolution played a very important role, not only in Soviet historiography, but also in policy, Soviet policy. The October Revolution was the point in time in history that was a starting point for all narrations for the Soviet identity. To all post-Soviet countries, in particular to Russia, transformation of myths is very important. Myths related to the October Revolution that were developed during the times of the Soviet Union in order to create a new narration, a new narrative that will be more conducive to the identity of post-Soviet countries. Soviet Russia, well, talking here about two stages of post-Soviet Russia when it comes to the historical memory. The first period at 1990s under Boris Yeltsin as president. Back then, official narrative was very critical about the Soviet period. In that period, the February Revolution was assessed as a continuum of revolutions, and October Revolution was perceived as a failure. Well, a new democratic Russia was presented and described as a country which in October 1917 decided to turn away from the democratic path. I have no time to say what happened in the 1990s, but all in all, within a decade, policy was actually the same. And then there was an attempt at reinterpreting the October Revolution, namely the 7th of November was a bank holiday until 2004, and however there were no official celebrations, no speech by the president, but this was a bank holiday. And then the chancellery of President Yeltsin, led by Chubais, initiated the day of understanding and commemoration. Simply the name of the bank holiday was changed. And then, under Putin, during the reform of the calendar, it was decided not to celebrate the 7th of November as a state holiday, and instead a new holiday was implemented, the 4th of November, the day of commemoration and understanding of all Russian reconciliation, to highlight the unity of Russians. So, as a result, the topic of revolution simply disappeared from the daily agenda. But 100-year anniversary of the event, which is a great historical event, brings back this topic to the agenda, to the discussions in Russia. So, simply something has to be done to commemorate this event. In 2013, when we were celebrated 100-year anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War, there was a discussion about the celebrations of the revolution, how to commemorate it. And there were, well, different opinions about this among officials who were considering what to do about this. And a decision was taken to organize some celebrations to commemorate the revolution. And the decision was taken on the 26th of December 2016, shortly or on the eve of the 100-year anniversary of the February Revolution. And this is an ordinance of Putin, a single-page document mentioning several aspects. Well, first of all, we are celebrating the 2017 revolution. No adjectives. We don't know what sort of revolution it is, great Russian or socialist revolution. Well, there are quite a lot of such adjectives in our historical textbooks, but none of them was used by President Putin in his ordinance. So it's not such a great event anymore. And second of all, well, we are not saying what sort of revolution we are celebrating, February or October. That's just defined as 1917 revolution in Russia. It's quite obvious that this decision results in the fact that the status of this revolution is diminished. The Russian Historical Association, headed by director by Sergei Naryshkin, well, is supposed to organize the celebrations. As a result, a reduction of the symbolic dimension leads to the question, what are we celebrating? What's the sense of this commemoration? Now, if we look at the agenda of the celebrations put forward by the Russian Historical Association, well, you will see an answer here. The ordinance was issued when the president was addressing the Russian parliament, and the following words were said, and I'm quoting them in the slide. And so this is what Chubais came up with for Boris Yeltsin. The words are agreement and conciliation between the next generations, and few of us identify themselves with those groupings, red or white. Few people, I'm not saying us, but generally few people identify themselves. So what of agreement and conciliation do we have in mind? Well, such an agreement, such an agreement and conciliation can be misunderstood, because the history of the 20th century in modern-day Russia is a debatable issue and is a cause of different conflicts. And the foundation of the conflicts involves different ideologies, because that's the case in every country. But the fact that the policy of memory in modern-day in Russia confronts two different paradigms with each other. One paradigm involves a critical approach, a traumatic one, murderous one, murderous past. And this has been on the agenda even under Gorbachev and Perestroika times. So there is a coalition which supports the policy of dealing with difficult matters of the past. On the other hand, the Soviet Union fell apart, and the countries that were established afterwards have to consider how they can develop their identities. And this is a traditional paradigm related to the development of nation. So we like to present things from the past that present us in a positive light. But the problem is that the work on historical memory, the 1917 events are a starting point for both paradigms. So not only do we have different ideological positions, but we also have different models. So work on historical memory, and where the 1917 topic is of essence, because it's quite clear that this is the beginning of a tragedy in the 20th century. But 1917 is at the same time the foundation of the Soviet identity, and you shouldn't forget about it. So we have to say that the paradigm of the development of nation is also visible on the global arena. Namely, it's about our contribution in the global events. So 1917 is also such an event. And it is my opinion that our discussions about the past and our unequivocal opinion about what happened in 1917 is related to that. So agreement and conciliation. Well, most of all, it needs saying that Putin and his administration recommend that we shouldn't approach this event as a historical event. And so the scope of commemoration would involve only conferences, scientific conferences, but no political events. So it seems to me that this is not a clear approach, because every memory of the past is a political act. Because when we remember something or remind others about something, we always present a certain point of view. One point of view is presented, the other isn't. So in my study, I approach commemoration as a tool of symbolical politics. In my opinion, symbolical politics involves fighting with different forms of interpretation. In my opinion, commemoration is a symbolical politics on the one side. So we have different views and narrative, which are competing narratives, but on the other side, symbolic policy, because, as I will try to prove, some organizations that work on memory policy, they match commemoration with their interpretation. And there is not enough time to talk about the methodology of my analysis, but if need be, I'm happy to explain it. But let me reiterate that my approach to commemoration is an approach which involves cooperation, and the outcomes of commemoration, whether it's an event of memory that changes cultural frameworks of memory, depends on cooperation and collaboration in the public zone and in the media. So I would like to focus on two analyses. Analysis of mnemonic factors, which involves studying historical retrospective, and analysis of definitions that bring historical events together. And I'd like to present three mnemonic actors which I think are key here. There are more of them as well. I will show you at the end of my speech, but they can change the general image of commemoration. Let us start with the governing elites. Governing elites are groups that we need to talk about in plural. They are taking decisions, and, well, we don't know how the decisions are taken, but based on some publications, we can imagine the competition inside the governing elites. Mr. Bartłomiej will be talking on this panel. He also published a paper on involving such an analysis. So I am defining four positions here. The first point of view corresponds to the historical narrative that is an official one at present, and that is based on the idea of 1,000-year anniversary of the Great Russian State and its legitimization. And considers President Putin considers 1917 as a breakdown, and we cannot celebrate this event from this point of view, because such a breakdown cannot be celebrated. But when we study sociological studies, we will see that some 38% of Russians perceive the October Revolution as a positive phenomenon, more or less positive phenomenon. On the eve of the presidential elections, you cannot ignore this fact. The other view was defined by the Minister of Culture, Vladimir Medinsky, who is head of another association of military or war historians. Well, a round table was organized, and he declared his approach back then. Briefly speaking, it's an idea of agreement and conciliation, whereby you celebrate 100-year anniversary as a non-political event to make sure that there's an agreement and conciliation between whites and reds. Another minister in the Russian Federation, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, proposes another point of view. In April 1916, he published an article about the history of foreign policy in Russia, and he referred to 100-year anniversary of the revolution. In his article, he was talking about commemoration, where a 100-year anniversary would be an international event. So Lavrov proposed certain international political formats. Lavrov mentioned falsifications in history which are contrary to Russia's interests. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to another version of commemorations proposed not by the governing elites, but by the authorities, namely how historical curriculum at schools. So the new concept was worked out, which is a more balanced one, and there is a committee of historians which consider different debatable issues, and they concluded how to define the revolution. Namely, the revolution was defined as a Great Russian Revolution of 1917-1922, so a longer period. This concept may match the official narrative because it's quite eclectic and it can involve different forms of memory of different groups. And each of those groups would be celebrating different aspects of the revolution or of the revolutions. But no one was prepared for that, actually. Now, you will see in this slide the second point of view is the main one, and the remaining ones involve the Great Russian Revolution of 1917. Now, since we are talking about the elites in Russia, well, Michael Berhard and Kubik classify the commemoration methods. So authorities are mnemonic pluralist. Putin actually said that this discussion is defining certain rules, and a patriotic position should be a rule. So the history should be positive, not the revolution, but Russian history was a positive one. And there is one more player, Communist Party of the Russian Federation, which has its parliamentary club, and it will participate both in presidential and parliamentary elections. To the communists, it's a very important anniversary. It needs saying that communists are a political power in Russia which will be celebrating 100-year anniversary. So to them, revolution is a positive event. So their narrative involves combining Marxist and nationalist approach. And the history of the Soviet Union is the golden age that was unfortunately lost. So October 2017 was the beginning of the golden age. That's in the opinion of communists. So this narrative is very similar to what older people like who are learning history from old textbooks. Communists have their own program of commemoration, and this is the only political force that is going to organize the events on an international level. They are preparing high-level meetings. They are preparing manifestations on the 7th or rallies on the 7th of November in Moscow. So for sure on that day there will be a lot of flags in Moscow and in other cities, and rallies organized by communists. So their main objective is to fight Russophobia and anti-Soviet approach. And why Russophobic approach? Well, because they say that there are some people who falsify the history of the Soviet Union and criticize this history. So if you're criticizing the history, you're not only anti-Soviet, but you're also you are also Russophobic. This party says that their interpretation is correct. Everybody else is wrong, and even they have put forward the thesis that whoever does not agree with us, they are Russophobic and anti-Sovietic. KPRF is a party which is operating in the current system. It has its representatives in all local parliaments and on the national level. So they have to have good relations with the governing elites, and they will not do anything that would put their existence at risk. So this applies, I'm talking here about the framework of patriotic discourse, which is organized by both the Communist Party as well as by the governing elites. And one more important actor, the Russian Orthodox Church, which has its own approach to both revolutions. To them, 1917 was very important both to the history of Orthodox Church as well as to the history of the country as such, because it was the beginning of a national tragedy which led to the fall of the state, and at the same time it's a very important period to the Orthodox Church because the Moscow Patriarchate was re-established. So the Orthodox Church is very flexible here. They do not insist on changing names of streets that are the names of murderers. In 2017, the Orthodox Church implemented a lot of measures to celebrate the anniversary related to the rebirths of Patriarchate, and they are also celebrating 80th anniversary of the Great Terror. They are developing the paradigm of critical approach to the past, and they do it in a very flexible way. And President Putin is participating in the measures to commemorate victims of political repressions in May this year. He also participated in an event in the Orthodox Church to commemorate those victims. So the management of RPC is supporting the ideas of agreement and conciliation. But there are also people of different who have different views with regards to the events of 1917. The general position is that they are in favor of the policy of agreement and conciliation.
So, on the one hand, there is no reconciliation. It has never been achieved. So no agreement and no reconciliation, because every political force has its own understanding. But yes, you can use such slogans, because from the point of view of the politicians. In fact, an interesting format has been devised. If you look at the agenda for celebrations, not on the 7th of November, but on the 4th of November, this is when the Reconciliation Monument is going to be inaugurated. Well, imagine, inauguration of the Reconciliation Monument in the Crimea, where our president is present, and of course he's going to be part of the presidential campaign, and it was devised exactly in this manner, but it didn't quite work. Why? Because the monument did not succeed in being built. Minister of Culture Medyński came up with the idea, and not the cabinet of the president. The monument was planned to be located in Kerch, but in Kerch they built a bridge now over the Kerchan Strait, and there is no decision to build it there. So perhaps Sevastopol. But in Sevastopol there is a movement very active called the Essence of Time, and ironically this movement gave strong support to Putin. They actually arranged demonstrations in favor of Putin. But this movement stood against erecting this monument in Sevastopol. Well, why? The activists of this movement do not quite see why they should want to reconcile with the former soldiers of the White Army, and secondly, they do not quite understand why the Ministry of Culture is engaged in that if the municipality of Sevastopol has its own procedures to this effect. And why aren't they consulted? So the Essence of Time activists are indeed extremely proactive, and 1 month before the planned inauguration, the court's session took place. It is fairly difficult to imagine how the authorities are going to emerge of this process unscathed. Now, another monument to be inaugurated on October 30th, and that monument is dedicated to the victims of political repressions. That's Sakharov Street in Moscow. Now, in early September, Kommersant published an article quoting sources from the President office to the effect that this monument should indeed be inaugurated. But on the 30th, yes, it is going to happen, but on the 4th they will not succeed to inaugurate the other one. It's hardly possible for them now to save their face. So historical policy is the sort of game where a mnemonic player can create trouble for another big player. And we can see it very clearly based on the example of the Essence of Time movement. Of course, they are not going to stop celebrating, but they are going to make it more difficult for the government to organize the centenary of the revolution. Well, thank you very much. Could we now ask Professor Kolonitskii? And perhaps we're going to have some discussion to follow. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to thank the organizers for excellent organization and logistics. My thanks go to our interpreters as well, who are doing a very good job there. Now, we've had a chance to listen to Olga, and I feel a little out of place because Olga has been handling these topics for a long time, and she does so very professionally, whereas I am only starting in this area. Now, my special interest is the revolution of 1917 in cultural terms and political history. Now, for a number of years, I've been asked by my colleagues, how do you, Russians, how are you going to celebrate the 1917 anniversary? How will you celebrate the revolution of 1917? And my answer has always been, I do not know. And I had a whole range of reasons for that. Well, we say that Russia is distinct by its unpredictable past, and for the modern Russia, the past is particularly unpredictable. So there's a number of factors that will come into play, and we do not know what's going to happen in a few weeks from now. Who will reach the decision and what level the celebrations will be organized on? I said, I don't know. This is something for Moscow to decide. In Petersburg, we live far away from the capital city, and that is where all the decisions are taken. We are an object of political decision, not the subject. Of course, we make effort to stand up for our own interest, but perhaps this kind of excuse is not entirely honest, so I decided to focus on this topic and provide some answers. Well, this year I published a book on the cult of the leader in 1917. And I do not know what the reception of my book will be, but I really took keen interest in the subject area. I published an article which I am very happy about, because now everyone can see to what degree my prophecy came true and to what degree it didn't. So that is my article, the German Historical Museum catalogue. Now, the anniversary is a resource, and this resource is benefited from by different players. And of course, the resources are limited. Money available for commemoration is fenced as well. So this is also the resource that nobody can monopolize 100%. I'm talking about the celebration of an anniversary. Well, this is the most famous monument to Lenin in front of the Finnish station, St. Petersburg. So this is the symbol of commemorations. Why did I say that it is impossible to monopolize memory? Well, the reason is that many players believed the October Revolution as their own, and they would not let go of it for the party in government to monopolize the experience of the celebration. There was a peasant uprising, the Tambov rising, back in 1920. One of the leaders, Antonov, who is now glorified by some political forces, he was actively engaged in the October Revolution. He was head of militias in Tambov. Machno believed his revolution was a third one, whereas they believed the Kronstadt dissidents as the revolutionaries as well. But October was the first event which legitimized their activities. So the battle for the October is long-lasting now. The left-wing SR wing organized a demonstration. The others on a different day. Rallies, demonstrations, and other kinds of political demonstrations. Now, for Gorbachev, October was also a point of legitimacy, and perestroika was part of that frame as well. But very soon, the October rhetoric turned against the monopoly of the Communist Party at a time of perestroika. All the power to the councils, that's the slogan of the Bolshevik revolution slogan. But again, if you say all the power, then that is also an expression of monopoly. Now, these were used in the Soviet period by the anti-communist forces as well. Many people gathering together in one point in time, and these celebrations could be used for other purposes as well. Sometimes these were deliberate actions, sometimes it was part of the general political culture. There are many Soviet traits in the rhetoric and the revolutionary symbolism. Yeltsin's speech on top of the tank during the coup, it's as if Lenin were speaking from the top of the armored vehicle. Did Yeltsin think about that? At the time, I do not know. And the day I already mentioned, this is the day of agreement and conciliation. But we do not know what kind of symbolism, what kind of rituals will come into the conciliation. I mean, the symbolism is entirely Soviet. The ribbon is very reminiscent of the Soviet ribbon going back to the October Revolution. And again, Soviet symbolism from the 50s. And the message of this graphic is far from being clear. A day of agreement and conciliation. That is what it said on the previous picture. Now, a cat and a dog. The friendship between the cat and the dog. The Communist Party and other leftist parties now try to utilize this narration in order to meet their own goals. In 1981, the Russian Orthodox Church, and then abroad, and then in the year 2000 in Moscow, the Church declared Nicholas II saint, so he was canonized. And this is what the Orthodox Russian Church did. It actually caused a lot of problems then and now. Well, I find it hard to imagine that he actually was a saint. I do not take sides with religious denominations. Some people believe him to be a saint, and I would not want to sound offensive in any way with respect to the religious beliefs. And this is the challenge that we do have. Now, sacralization is very important too. As Olga rightly said, in 2004 there was an attempt to change the dates, change of the date and change of the name of the holiday. I think that was an attempt to resurrect the 19th century Russian patriotism, which was related to the Romanov dynasty. And at that time there were different waves, Polonophilia as well as Polonophobia, and both were cashed in on by different groups. And in 1989 there was Nina Pożarska's film made, so the year was very pertinent. And when did Stalin take his decision? Well, the two dates overlap, 7th of November, clearly. So the point was to Sovietize both events. Now, this proves that even after the change, they do not quite know what to do with the celebration. Come along or bring your friends. Bring your friend and you'll get a bonus. So the celebration is also commercialized. Now, this would probably invoke the image of the friendship of all the Russian Federation nations. Well, it is foreseeable, isn't it, for the rightist movement, year in, year out, the 4th of November gives an opportunity to become visible. And please note how many police officers are engaged to keep order on that day. Well, I believe there are a number of things, a number of factors that will help us foresee what will happen going forward. Well, the point is that the tradition of the sort of celebrations we had before must not have a bearing on celebrations in 2017. And major players seem to be limiting their exposures. No, Putin and the others are also limited in their action. Now, 10 years ago, in 2007, that year was used to reinforce anti-revolutionary tendencies. So there was an article by Solzhenitsyn, which was published. But these actions relied on the existing sentiment in the public. Why? Because in the Soviet times, revolutionary tradition was very important, and revolutionary heroes were glorified. And that resource was later used that was used by the communist authority, but also by anti-communist opposition. And the attitudes on the part of the public towards revolution have changed. Well, irrespective of what they think about the February Revolution or the October Revolution, more and more Russians believe that at all cost new revolutions should be prevented. Well, it doesn't mean that they do not support the incumbent government, but sociological surveys were performed, but there were petitions to the authorities to prevent new revolutions. It doesn't mean that one will not happen, but this topic is discussed. Also, in the opposition, 70% against a revolutionary solution. And now, the attitudes on the part of Ukrainians and Russians vis-à-vis revolution. Well, there are two different points of view. The 100th anniversary of the Second World War was a major celebration. August the 1st, 2014, saw the inauguration of a monument in Moscow. Putin gave a speech, and he talked about the heroic Russian soldier. He also said that the fruit of this effort was hijacked by the secretive stab in the back. But the president never said which enemy actually stabbed the back of the brave Russian soldier, so you could interpret it in your own way. Masons, Bolsheviks, foreign imperialists, you name it. Well, he actually said that Lenin was the enemy, so very clearly he is not a great advocate of Lenin. Putin met with young historians and he put it very bluntly, but publicly he would not admit that he is not an admirer of Lenin. Heroes, that's reconstruction. Heroes of the First World War. And that's Girkin, Styokov, a well-known character, activist in the pro-Russian forces in the east of Ukraine. He's making clear reference to the First World War. On the left-hand side, you see the heroes of the First World War, and on the right-hand side, his own soldiers, in a way, representing the continuation of the effort. And this will probably be used by Putin. The myths and the truth about the home war. Who killed Russia? That's the title. The Aurora cruiser and the special services, it's all explained now. There was no engagement of the British services, but that kind of point of view tends to dominate among the journalists. Now, the causes of the October Revolution. What caused the revolution? A plot of the enemies of the Russian nation, one study. 20% of the populace believes it was the plot of the enemies of the Russian nation. It's strange, but that's what it is. These are real figures. And the project Olga mentioned in the beginning. Now, the Monument of Reconciliation, this is the Ministry of Culture. Of course, you cannot implement this. The reason is that every memorial needs at least minimum support from academic circles. Well, I understand that politicians may treat history lightly, but sooner or later this will be their undoing. When we talk about the white spots in history, once this happened, the system crumbled, and at the moment the dominant current in historiography is the identification of many revolutions and many home wars they write about. And they say today that you cannot talk about the home war as a war between the Reds and the Whites. Well, if you have good secondary education, will never agree with this kind of approach. Very obviously, nobody wants to reconcile in Russia. It's a very difficult conciliation, but the need for that is there, and reconciliation monuments are being inaugurated. This is a privately owned monument erected in the land belonging to a school in St. Petersburg. The hats, military hats of the Red Army and the White Army. That's in Novocherkassk. The reconciliation monument, the biggest one. So, in a way, the previous approach was incorporated here. Kolchak, a monument in Irkutsk. And again, the reconciliation motif represented on the plinth. But again, most of the people do not want this reconciliation. This is Tsar Nicholas II, which was damaged, 1987, rebuilt in 2000. This is the Lenin monument. There was an attempt at destroying it, now rebuilt. And this is the monument that is planned to be inaugurated in Novosibirsk. This monument is erected in the area belonging to the church. Again, there was an attempt at dismembering it, or disassembling it at least. The battle goes on. Antonov and Wrangel. Well, they wouldn't necessarily speak the same language, but according to the communists who actually use it, and their rally did not quite matter. And they are not the ones who would want any reconciliation either.
And this is Putin's message to the parliament, and these are the figures that Olga mentioned. 48% of people considering that the October Revolution was a positive phenomenon and played a positive role, while 31% of people think it was negative, both as a phenomenon as well as in its outcomes. So the trend is a long-term one, simply speaking. And one more important thing, a lot of Russian citizens are not really very well acquainted with the Russian history, but they think they know everything about the Russian Revolution, and everybody will say their mind on that, and I think they can do so. And this is what I was able to foresee, namely that we historians will not be influencing this jubilee. And now political activists considered to be positive ones. Lenin still ranking first, but the popularity of Stalin has been growing. Nicholas II ranked fourth. Ranked third, Dzierżyński and Nicholas II. And the founders of the political police. So different views on the October revolutions have been presented or reflected on these monuments. In Kirov, Dzierżyński monument was unveiled. In Chelyabinsk, Stolypin was commemorated. He is the Russian Prime Minister who offered a conservative direction. Surgut, a local organization, unveiled the monument of Stalin. So we have this civil society which has different responses because the civil society is perceived as something positive. But anyway, people have different approaches. And a commemorative plaque at the place of death of Grand Prince Serge, who was killed by terrorists in 1905. In 1918, his monument was destroyed there, also by with the involvement of Lenin, and now it was unveiled again. So this was the greatest commemorative event that doesn't have a direct reference to the 1917 revolution and its anniversary. And now an external context, events in Ukraine, the fall of Lenin, destruction of Lenin monuments. So the approach to Lenin and the events such as this one are interpreted differently in Russia. Some are positive about it, some are negative about it. So right now it is not Lenin that is the main figure that defines this period in history. The most debates revolve around Nicholas II and Stalin, and I really like this picture, and I think this is one of the reasons why a lot of people in Russia are very cautious about damaging and destroying monuments, because doing away with them takes place within the framework of the same culture that may overthrow you. And what I wasn't able to foresee, well, I wasn't able to foresee the wave of protests in Russia, but the topic of revolution is not present in those processes. For example, one of the leaders of the protests in Russia presented here in the picture is compared to Kerensky, and well, here the image is saying, Russia, don't make the same mistake twice. And the same thing here. And I wasn't able to foresee this film. I didn't know there would be such a heavy response. This is the film entitled Matilda, The Secrets of the House of Romanovs, and a very strong element in the discussion, a very good Polish actress starring in this movie, and has no reference or position on history. But the main person organizing protests against this film was Madame Pokłońskaja, a deputy in the Duma of the Russian Federation. So you can see very hefty response of some extreme forces. These are the people representing the seeming Cossack movement, and the one on the right is promising that he will cause that he will destroy cinemas that broadcast this film because it offends the Russian nation. So this film is the cause for a lot of debates in the Russian society. And another example, somehow this is an eclectic combination which reflects the policy of memory that Olga talked about. Nikolai II was in a way a good person, and the same applies to Stalin. So Yeah, maybe someone else has a tattoo of Lenin, but since we are talking about the memory of the Russian society, the society does not have any space for Lenin in its memory. And now what I couldn't foresee and what really surprised me is that the resources of this jubilee haven't been thoroughly taken advantage of. I thought different political forces would do that. And, well, President Putin is afraid of the colorful revolutions, so he wants to be silent about the 1917 revolution. But I don't think this is argument enough, because the majority of citizens of Russia and us, we refer to it as anti-revolutionary consensus, and it's present in the modern day in Russia. Different people with different views simply don't want the 1917 revolution to repeat itself. And that's it from me. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So we had a geographical and chronological discussion. So Mr. Włodzimierz Borodziej, who will be talking about Poland that's already gone, at least to a large extent is gone. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's 3:37 p.m. And actually, I feel like my presentation is unnecessary because after 2 wonderful lectures, I feel the need to debate them, to talk about them, because as the moderator has rightly said, they were talking about vivid issues, about the relationship between history and the present times. But what I would like to present to you is, in fact, archaeology, ladies and gentlemen. It's the world that's already sank, and a lot of people present here are not able to recreate that. So, since we are pressed for time, I will have a question to Olga Malinova, who only talked about political actors about the church as a political force in this dimension, while Boris Kolonitskii paid attention to something that I pay attention to when I have classes with my students on European political history, namely that, as Boris has said, whatever historians are saying doesn't matter, because human imagination, also historical imagination, is shaped by art, starting with high art and ending with the lowest one. So now a question to Olga. Some distinguished stories, different films than Matilda, other elements of pop culture. Does this fit in any way? Does this count in any way in the present? But that's a question for later. And now, together with Bartłomiej Gajos, we agreed that we would announce the topic Polish People's Republic and the October Revolution on the example of 2 anniversaries of 1977 and 1987. Because if I were to speak about all anniversaries in the Polish People's Republic, you would escape this conference before it was over. So I'm going to talk about 2 anniversaries, but I have to start with a certain background to make them understandable. And the third remark is that research on that is carried out by myself and Maciej Kurden. So if I say we, I don't mean Pluralizm Majestatis, but I mean that we were doing research together. So now, one by one, ladies and gentlemen, what have we discovered? What have we found? Now, if we were asked about when the anniversary of October Revolution started being celebrated in Poland, we would say 1947, 1957, but we discovered that the first celebrations of the revolution was in 1918 in November, namely a magazine called Nasza Trybuna, proto-communist newspaper, 2 days after the establishment of the Lublin government, and Lubelski government was actually the first government in half-independent Poland, a leftist, socialist, and anti-communist government. So when the government was being established, the newspaper published Trotsky's and Lenin's pictures on the front page and wrote a very long, a very characteristic comment on that, saying that the enemy of the Polish proto-communists was did not involve conservatives and other forces. So the enemy was the Polish independent left, so the Polish Socialist Party, briefly speaking. That's true. We didn't discover everything, but you need to bear that in mind when you talk about anniversaries in the Polish People's Republic, namely that we are facing a competition of sorts. So we have November of Petrograd and Moscow, and November of Lublin, and then of Warsaw a year later. And in between the wars, we have the competition between the 7th of November, imperial one, the 7th of November, a local one, and the 11th of November, which is the date of independence, which has more of a Warsaw dimension. And the fact that Bolshevism, Sovdepia, that it's all been functioning as a slur word in the after-war Poland, well, that's obvious. That's one of the factors that unite everyone across all parties, rejection of the Bolshevik revolution. But the competition of anniversaries is very important. In 1926, the Prime Minister Piłsudski issued a letter which granted status of semi-national holiday to the date 11th of November. It was supposed to be a semi-national holiday, and no one was able to find this letter, which testifies to the legal culture of the then established regime. Maybe someone will find it, but it's not present in the official files. But that was a comment on the margin. So we have the competition of communist traditions and anniversaries, different dates in the period between the war, and the competition is then solved by means of a law dated 1937, which establishes that 11th of November is going to be a national holiday, a true national holiday. And then we have the Polish People's Republic. And what is very interesting here are the celebrations of the 40th anniversary in 1957. Władysław Gomułka goes to Moscow as the national communist, and that's something, the wording that we don't often use in Poland, but that's the way he's perceived in the West. And he delivers says things that are totally different than what Khrushchev or Mao Zedong says. And the representative of Czechoslovakia who speaks after him, because Gomułka was the third one. Khrushchev and Mao Zedong were before him. And let me quote here what Gomułka said. The road of every country to socialism is defined by concrete historical conditions, concrete arrangement of class forces on a national and global scale. Thus, a conclusion that the road which the Soviet Union took towards socialism may not be the same in the conditions of other countries. And then he goes on to say that the specificity of Poland is related to partitions of Poland. Poland has the right to have a different approach to the October Revolution. So this is a point in time in the history of Polish People's Republic which needs our attention, because if you read different texts very generally, it may not be obvious, but at this point in time, Gomułka legitimizes October of 1956. And then another anniversary, 1967, that's a totally different thing. There's no talking about Polish road to socialism, Polish differences and stuff like that. But there is a motive of the 11th of November. This motive is coming back because 40-year-old historians belonging to the party, they try to rehabilitate the 11th of November. And Gomułka meets them. I'm not going to quote now exactly. And he explains to them, like a father of the nation, yes, you are good comrades. I have no doubts in your good intentions, but you have to be very careful indeed. And this road leads nowhere to nowhere. And then Henryk Jabłoński writes about this, an article, and he gives the same message, that to all socialist nations, October Revolution is a true beginning, and they shouldn't try to juxtapose it with their own national holidays, state holidays. And then we have the celebrations of 1977, and I have nothing to say about them. And the ritual is the same as every year. So we have days of Soviet cinema. We have some events with secretaries organizing academies in their provinces. We have central plenary session, in this case in the Palace of Culture, and the Polish delegation goes to Moscow for one reason or another. The Prime Minister was leading this delegation, and Piotr Jaroszewicz, when he was delivering his speech in Moscow, said exactly the same thing, and as his Czechoslovak predecessor in 1956, counterpart in 1956, that there is a single way towards socialism, and Poland is on this road. So the ritual is recreated and repeated till mid-1980s, and then there is a non-typical epilogue. So the ritual is continuously the same, but when you see the first page of Trybuna Ludu newspaper, it's totally different than the one from 1960 or 67 or 77, because the issue that I'm going to comment on right now has an article of Politburo, or a message, which says the following: who will do it for us unless we do it ourselves? And the spokesperson of the government, Jerzy Urban, says to foreign journalists, stop asking me those questions, why Poland is different than it used to be. Simply, it's going to be different in Poland from now on. And you have to put the 7th of November in this context, because rules of loyalty oblige. And the equipe of Jaruzelski, with a certain delay, tries to catch up with the changes that it's not able to control. And the first secretary of the Central Party comes back after 30 years to Gomułka's formula. We are building socialism in Poland by taking advantage of historical universalities in historically different conditions. After Jaruzelski came back, the 9th of September, a big debate of the Polish Workers' Party takes place, which decides to commemorate the 11th of November in a year, next year, 50th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War. And the Trybuna Ludu newspaper publishes articles of top historians. Names are not important anymore because it's all archaeological, who try to describe it from scratch. And they set the pantheon of the most rewarded Poles from 1918, from Daszyński to Dmowski, and we will find only 2 names of communists there. 8 remaining ones were non-communists. So, and something that is equally characteristic for the climate of 1987 is that both party historians, when they want to prove something, why what they are writing is right and true, they both make references to the to non-party historians such as Pieniewicz or Pajewski. So, over a few decades of the Polish People's Republic, some sort of history started, and it ended with coming back to the norm which was known from the interwar period. So, it took me 15 minutes. Thank you.
Dziękujemy, panie profesorze. A teraz...
Well, thank you very much, Professor. Now the last speech on the panel, Bartłomiej Gajos will speak about Russia, so we are back with Russia. That's true, we're back with Russia. My situation is rather comfortable, given Professor Malinova and Professor Kolonitskii's contributions thus far, who brought a general picture of the memory policy over the past 26 years. On the other hand, my situation is made more difficult because if I keep talking for too long, you may miss your planes, so I'll try to be brief. Now, let's look at the top central level, which has not been mentioned. I think this is a very interesting point in time, a quarter of a century of the existence of Russian Federation, when 41 million were born after 1991, who've not been through the Soviet school, who do not carry the historical load, so to speak. And if you add to it those who were born before but who went to school in the times of the Russian Federation, this gives 55 million, which accounts for 1/3 of the total population in Russia. So how will the Soviet Revolution pass down in the memory of those who do not have Soviet experience? And second comment, over the past 74 years, I mean between 17 and 91, Russia had to reinvent itself 3 times. So history as a resource providing for the possibility of reinvention is very important. And thirdly, experiencing time. Obviously, the communist ideology is future-oriented, building communism. and the 26 last years, Russia has been backward-looking. Russia is looking back, and that's where she looks, tries to find herself. Now, memory is a symbolic resource which is used by many politicians. Secondly, I'll consider the problem of processing the past, decommunization, with reference to the October Revolution. Thirdly, I'll try to mention the issue of identity. And fourthly, the future. How will the memory of the October Revolution be passed down to the new generation? Now, I'd like to consider to what extent the Tambov case is specific and distinct from the central mainstream. Secondly, what are the roadblocks in reworking, processing the Soviet memory? Tambov's, that's third, Tambov's urban space. And fourth, what do we see in the regions from you cannot quite see from the central position, central level? Now, this is the Tambov province, whose southern parts saw the Antonov uprising, which has also been mentioned. The Antonov uprising, if I may add on to what Professor Kolonitskii said, well, he was an SR member. Secondly, the February Revolution set him free because he'd been in prison. Thirdly, initially he sympathized with the October Revolution. Why is Tambov region specific? Well, it is an agricultural region, 98% Russian population, so really there are no minorities there. Fourthly, if you go by Natalia Zubariewicz's topology of four Russias, she split up Russia in four parts according to growth, people, and so on and so forth. So this would be the second Russia, from 20 to 50,000 population, in which the Soviet lifestyle is preserved. Our Tambov is different because now it has 200,000 inhabitants, and it is not a classic industrial, post-industrial Soviet city. And fifthly, the last point about Tambov, this is the Tambov district, Borysoglebsk, which no longer forms part of the Tambov region. Now, in the 90s, Tambov was part of the so-called Red Belt, where the communist parties garnered very high support in the elections. And to give you an idea, well, it is enough to look at the referendum results to maintain the Soviet Union. 83% wanted to keep Soviet Unions, more than 10% on the central level. So communists play an important role until the end of the 1990s. And now I come back to the first part, which is the Yeltsin era. And that's Tambov, 450 kilometers south of Moscow. The discussion on the heritage and the October Revolution is understood as Petersburg developments in 1917, But as Marderol and Malisheva noted, now it's no longer historical commemoration of Petersburg events. It's now the commemoration of all the history of the Soviet Union. In other words, the attitude towards the October Revolution, if you ask the elderly generation in particular, is identified with the entire Soviet period. And that's quite important. Now, the discussion on the Soviet legacy started quite early on. The first article on the legacy of the revolution in urban space was actually published in 1991 in Жизнь. Now, this publication was renamed from Tambovskaya Pravda into Жизнь. There was an article, Время для парадов, where the author referred to Marshal Shapochnikov's and Gorbachev's suggestions not to celebrate the anniversary that year. Well, he did more than that. Chernyshkin was the author of the article. He further claimed that the 7th of November should be deprived of its official status because it was a coup, it was no revolution, and instead rejecting the yoke of the communist regime should be, according to him, celebrated. And he made specific proposals concerning Tambov and what should be done. Lenin monument should be removed. It's there, centrally located. Now, this monument played an important role in transforming the urban tissue. Until 1937, it was the church square, Sobor Spasobrazinski, still there, and this is where all the major demonstrations took place and commemorations. And then, in 1937, the theatre square was renamed Lenin Square, and the monument to Lenin was erected. And since then, all the major commemorations are focused on that square. Well, that is the same monument. Now, in 1967, the monument was replaced with a new one. Because of the wear and tear. Now, this monument is clearly identified with the October Revolution, became the focal point of the discussion, and there was a polemic in Tambovska Жизнь, in which Mr. Vorovyov admitted that yes, because of economic reasons, back in 1981, we should not have organized parades. But falling back on his personal experience, he said that October meant leaving poverty, that October for him is economic growth, and the whole history that followed. This is exactly what was repeated at every anniversary of this kind during the Soviet times. There's also a regional component. Vorobyov said that, true, that Lenin was not himself related to Tambovshchina, but he once met with the delegates of the Tambovsk region, province. And then there was a debate on the meaning of the 7th of November. Was that a coup Was that a revolution? And is it positive or negative? No, the economics issue, very important at the time. So this was continued throughout 1990s, but 1991 marked the only year when no official celebrations were organized, no parade, no rallying, no demonstrations. And it was only in 1992 that Alexander Yablov, who was head of the provincial administration, who organized such celebrations. Well, that's 1995 as it happens, but he organized these and they would be staged every year. Now, the rally moves towards the Lenin Monument. In terms of the reception of central changes, these are not noticed, because 1995 there was a change of the festivities. The 7th of November should not commemorate October Revolution, but should commemorate the parade which took place on 7th November 41, when the Red Army soldiers just marched out of the city and went to the front line. So the two are merged, October and the Great War, completely unnoticed there in the region. Then, 1995, the agreement and reconciliation. You will not see any trace of it in Tambov. It went completely unnoticed. The Communist Party organizes its marches, its parades on the 7th of November year in, year out. And as Professor Malinova said, the day of reconciliation has no symbolism or ritualism to it at all. That would lie some kind of foundation for such celebrations. As an interesting development, the memory of Antonov and the Antonov remembrance, and there are two directions. One is the central line. This is the Wandea Memorial. In 1993 it was inaugurated. Alexander Solzhenitsyn was present at the ceremony of inauguration, and he gave a speech, and I'll quote from that speech. Someone might think that the experience of the French Revolution was a sufficient lesson for the creators of human happiness. No, because developments in Russia were much more cruel and their scale was much, much greater. International socialists recreated many of the atrocities of the French Revolution on a larger scale, and these were better organized. We did not have a Thermidor, but we had our own Vandea, which was more than one. There were big uprisings in Tambov. We know the episode. Hundreds of peasants in woven shoes, called upon by the church bells, were shot at with machine guns. The uprising took 11 months to suppress, even though the communists tried hard to suppress it by means of armored vehicles. So this is one line which on the central level tries to promote the idea. Yeltsin takes up the project. He issued a decree on peasant uprisings whose participants are rehabilitated. Then Solzhenitsyn published two short stories in Nowy Mir, where through the eyes of his protagonist he depicts the experience of Tambov during the uprising. And the articles are printed in local print media, which discuss the following question: should Antonov be remembered as a noble rebel against the Bolsheviks, or Should we go back to the Soviet canon and label it as the uprising fomented by armed bandits against legitimate government? And this discussion has been going on since mid-1990s, and there's an expression of that in urban space of Tambov. Interestingly, the memory is initiated in a way not through official initiative, but through the initiative of Solzhenitsyn. Secondly, in the early 1990s, not a single Soviet monument had been removed in Tambov. And what is new is the conflict concerning the interpretation of Antonov. Now, KPRF lost power in favor of Yeltsin and then won Russia. And since 2000 to date, we'll have seen a debate on the Antonov uprising. What do we do with him? Does he merit being celebrated at all? This is the Kazan monastery, not far from which the first memorial plaque will be erected. The yellow building is the monastery, the Cheka division used to have a seat there, and the plaque will be placed not far from there. So this shows you the location of the plaque, and that's it. It's 1999. The founders believe the plaque is located in the burial place of Antonov. He was killed together with his brother in Nizhny Shibrai, but they were brought to Tambov and were interned in a place no one knows, but local historians, activists related to democratic movement of Yeltsin and the Memorial Association. 1 month after it was erected, the plaque was gone. It was stolen. Nobody knows who took it. And then on June the 24th, a monument, it is a monument now, was unveiled. On the 24th of June. It is not an accidental date, because this is the date on which Antonov and his brother were killed. A fight for righteous causes for us, outspoken in the name of homeland and the truth. Again, it was hijacked in 2001, and in 2002, the cornerstone was unveiled to initiate the monument of victims of the uprising. But again, it was demolished, it was vandalized, swastika was actually painted on it. So it was removed, but it never came back. So in 2015, a petition was sent to the governor Nikitin with a request for the cornerstone to be returned. And indeed, the cornerstone returned in 2016, but it's a different stone, as you can surely notice. And in 2016, another debate broke out in the local Duma on whether Antonov and the peasant uprising merits to be commemorated at all. And let me quote the representative of the Russian Federation. This would mean rehabilitating bandits, which is cynical given the context of the revolution. On top, he sent Borotnikov's letter, FSB chief, who spoke on whether Antonov's uprising should be treated as a legitimate uprising, or just the opposite. Was this a rebellion by the bandits? So the net result is no, it should not be commemorated because he would set up bands of bandits, but the rank and file members, partisans, yes, they merit to be commemorated. So Antonov's name is mentioned, and this is very fresh from 3 weeks ago. The plaque was changed again, and the name of Antonov is gone. Of course, the Antonov motif would appear in the central level as well. Andriy Smirnov film, Wandowska Wandera, which was also released on Nowa Rosja Kultura, Culture, New Russia channel. And then the Minister of Culture, well, not yet, Minister to be, he said that he will make effort to declare the activities aimed against the uprising to be genocide. Now, the October Revolution celebrations in the media or on the internet, this does not regenerate any discussion, but very importantly, over the past 26 years, the changes in locations of commemorations. At the top, there's a sports hall called Crystal, which hosts the Festival of National Unity on November the 4th. And if you wonder what's the relationship between this holiday and the other one, and why this place in the first place? There's nothing historically which would point to that place. But the local inhabitants believe that, well, this is a small square, so we can show that many people come. Next to it, there is a seat of the One Russia party, and it now aspires to be a central spot in Tambov. And then in green, there is the church square, the Sobor square, where all the parades took place, and the red circle is the Lenin monument. Now, to conclude, regionally, and that is not seen from the central level, there is a conflict of memory. That's number one. Number two, the remembrance of the Antonov uprising was initiated by the actors that were non-official actors, I mean not related to the state, Russian state. And that is a hard nut to crack. And Franz Waffier wrote in 1988 in his essay on the French Revolution that it came to an end, became a history, and stopped being subject of public debate. Now, it seems that the incumbent government, by trying to be silent about it, does prove that the October Revolution is not relegated only to history and still gives rise to heated debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now we know a lot about Tambov, which is quite important, and obviously we have a problem, and I'm to be blamed for that. No time for the right debate, although honestly speaking, I simply didn't want to interrupt such great speeches which told us what's happening in Russia. So we are grateful to a professor who summed up the most important facts. So we'll try to have a final discussion. Thank you very much. You presented different paradigms, and thank you so much for that. Well, you didn't say anything about one important paradigm, namely LDPR party, Zhirinovsky's party. He has his own approach. Sorry for this remark. And, well, communists do not have a big impact in big cities, which is proven by local elections. And LDPR is a strong party, and on the wave of these celebrations, it can play a role here. Could you comment on that? And one more comment as regards Professor Kolonitskii and the I have to say that the Association of Historians of the First World War has done a lot to build the monument on the Pokłonnaya mountain, and we did this consulting things with the organizers. I was a member of the council, social council, when it comes to the celebrations of the anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. Now, we weren't the ones who prepared Putin's speech, but we had impact on its contents. So we wrote some expert papers on different topics and different areas. And one more thing related to sociological research and demand for that. You said rightly that 40% of population in Russia was raised in the post-Soviet period. And the recent manifestations in big cities point to the fact that there is a need to interpret the revolution, especially among the younger generation of Russia. Could you comment on that? Well, thank you very much. Of course, first questions, and then everybody will respond. I have a small question to Mr. Kolonitskii. So, about the support for Dzierżyński on such a high level. We all understand Russia, but not fully. So less popularity in ranking is one thing, but the monument, Dzierżyński monument, is something else. And a question to Bartłomiej Gajos, not really a question, but a follow-up. There are two more elements that I guess we should pay attention to in the public space. First of all, there is a chamber of memory of Antonovshchina, so Tambov rebellion. Sorry, the speaker is not using the mic. So it's worth mentioning it that this chamber of memory of the Tambov rebellion presented also those atrocities as peasants were murdered with combat gases, and Karsieczewski participating in the crushing of this uprising. And sorry, I can't hear the comments on the side. So there is a monument which crowns everything that you've been talking about. It's not fully understandable, but it's a monument of a Russian peasant So these were rich peasants. In Tambov, the land was very fertile, and there was this slogan before revolution: you can actually sow anything, and you will raise very rich crops. And please be brief. Last question. Apologies to everyone else who wanted to ask a question. My question is addressed at the gentleman who deals with cultural policy and who invested Karinski's cult. To what extent the cult of Nikolai II is similar to Karinski's cult? Is it developed according to the same pattern? Is there a similar approach? And another question. It may be also a question to Olga Malinova. What is the role of the project of New Martyrs in the context of celebration of 100-year anniversary of the revolution? We'll start with Olga. Thank you very much. Well, I'll try to answer the question quite quickly and comment on what other speakers said. When it comes to the celebration of the memory days, the 4th of November, well, switching 7th of November to 4th of November was initiated by the Council of Religion, Council of Church, and well, these are this is a traditional Orthodox church in Russia. So the 7th of November wasn't a day worthy of the name of Day of Agreement and Conciliation, so they decided they would move it to the 4th of November. This is the day celebrating God's Mother of Kazan, and it was simply in a way related to the event that is commemorated. There are differences between calendars, but it was supposed to be celebrated on the 5th of November. So the decision was very important. It wasn't really consulted with professional historians. Sorry, we can't go into details because some of us have a plane to catch. Okay, one more thing about the 7th of November 1941. When the decision was adopted, communists and other leftist parties started challenging it. In Russia, our memory days are regulated in two documents: the labor code, which is difficult to change, and in December 2004 it was changed, and the second law is an act on memory days and heroism, and the Duma implements different changes. In 2005, at the initiative of the Labor Committee managed by communists, well, they wanted the 7th of November to be the day of November Revolution because it's a memory day, and they wanted to make it the day of soldiers' fame, and to commemorate the 7th of November 1941. In my study, I investigated all political parties, and LDPR party was included in it as well. Zhirinovsky doesn't have a clear position on the Soviet authorities. He's anti-Soviet or anti-Sovietchik, according to the wording of the Communist Party of the Russian Federation, but he's not Russophobic. The party doesn't have any program for commemoration, and when journalists asked about the anniversary of the revolution, they say that they might come up with something. Bartłomiej, you talked about socialization. You put forward your thesis. Let me point out that when we talked about agreement and conciliation, there was an argument raised by Naryshkin, who cynically said about something very important, namely that we have a generation which has never celebrated the 7th of November, because pupils at school, and they know that such a day well, we can't say that they don't know about this day in history, but there are generations that have never celebrated this event. They never participated in commemorative events. And this doesn't only apply to history, but it only applies to all other practices of daily life. And another very important component from the world of art. In Russia, there's a special program prepared for for all celebrations, films, songs, and things like that. So on the one hand, the October Revolution was related to different works of art that were prepared in the Soviet period. And now, in the post-Soviet period, I am not aware of any studies that would investigate the world of art, but I think it's quite possible to compare these two periods, the Soviet one and post-Soviet ones. And now another thing, the new martyrs, a very important topic, because the Russian Orthodox Church is a very important mnemonic actor, player, that calls on the commemoration of political repression, and the Memorial Association supports that. So what about canonization of martyrs? What is it all about? This year, Kirill said that there were 1,800 people to be canonized. They were martyrs, and people who will be commemorated in every Orthodox church. So people pray for them every day in the Orthodox Church. Nikolaus II is not a saint. He was canonized. I don't remember the exact definition, but he is a martyr as well. He's not a saint. He's a martyr. And finally, I subscribe to what the previous speaker said, that the politics of memory in post-Soviet Russia is a very important area. There are a lot of different players who operate on the regional, local level. And in this context, memory policy is changing. The president's office thinks it manages the process, but that's not the case. Different cities have varying approaches. To understand political memory, you need to carry out respective research. Now, considering the planes and trains to catch, historians. Well, sometimes historians are asked things that's unquestionable. But could you quote some important social discussion that was initiated by the historians? No, we've never had such discussion. So historians have a status of experts, Well, the question is whether they do have such a status. No, and there are several reasons for that. Now, Dzierżyński. When it comes to ranking's legacy, it's there, but, well, there was an information about repressions, that's why he's less popular. Dzierżyński is a KGB symbol. And WCK. So it's no surprising that still he has some supporters. He has lobbyists who have been supporting him. They are veterans of WCK and KGB, FSB, who will not quit because of loyalty towards him. So they are Orthodox, but they honor his memory. Nicholas II, I can see 3 lines of commemoration. The first line is a religious one. That's one line, and the other one, family values, family, father, children. And the third one involves respect, and the film Matilda reflects that. And people identify themselves with Nikolai II, and they simply see the history of that period through his family.
Istnieją 2 stereotypy o Rosji.
Well, there are 2 cliches about Russia. One, in Russia everything is better, and 2, in Russia everything is worse. And I'm very happy that my colleagues have proven that my cliche-ridden attitude towards Russia, where everything is possible, has been confirmed by them. Indeed, there is a remembrance hall in the museum, but it has never been discussed on a regional level. And secondly, it does not commemorate the peasant or Antonov uprising or Tambov uprising. It's called Tambovska Wandeer. And I think the reason for that is that money that funded the Chamber of Memory came from the Ministry of Culture. It was a grant. That was the time when genocide issue was raised. So money came from the central level. But if you ask people in Tambov, nobody actually relates this exhibition with Wandeer. It is a Tambov uprising. And indeed, the monument of the Tambov man, Tambovski Muzhik, indeed it was opened, inaugurated there. The problem was that when the representative of local authorities spoke, he talked about a Russian peasant who fed and defended Russian soil. So it's completely removed from the local context. Again, this is not research, this is impressions I'm talking about. So I asked people, what about the monument of Tambov? And they say, which one? The Kronstadt Square or the plaque that I showed you? So they do associate these facts together. Yes, they do, but that's not what the original idea was. It's a matter of choice. Well, there are 2 important issues. Number 1, I need to thank all the panelists, but I agree with my colleagues. I would like to thank our interpreters. Thank you very much. And the organizers in the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue. Perhaps a final word? Well, thank you very much on my own behalf of my colleagues, my team. It has been a teamwork. I may be a little more about that. Katarzyna Kołakowska, Paulina Baranowska, Olga Malinova and Bartłomiej Gajos, the four people made it happen, and really the credit for that goes to them, and I'd like to thank the interpreters for the excellent, amazing work. It was a major challenge. Now, we are nearing the end. I'm sure some of us would want more, and we'll try to quench your thirst for more via publications. And we ask you to deliver to us your papers. We will try to issue a publication after this event, which will help us navigate through various circles of revolution, local, national, international. Next year, circumstances permitting, such a publication should be made available. Thank you very much. Thank you, the participants, for your input, and you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us in a great number. And I would like to thank two persons who are important to this conference. One has left, Professor Marek Kornat, and the other person is Professor Mariusz Wołos, still present here. Thank you. Thank you, and hope to see you again at our events.